The spreadsheet glowed on my laptop screen at 2 in the morning, numbers dancing in columns that would change everything. I could hear Daniel breathing softly beside me in bed, exhausted from another 14-hour day at the office. His office, technically, though we both knew who really ran it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to send the email that would secure the Whitman contract, the deal that would push Daniel's company past the $8 million mark. $8 million. From nothing. In 3 years. I'm Sarah Harper, and I'm about to tell you how I built my husband's empire for one very specific reason, so we could afford to never see his parents again. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story compelling, if you want to hear more accounts like this, please take a moment to click that subscribe button. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment with your city or country. It helps me understand who's listening, and it reminds all of us that these experiences are universal. Thank you for being here. That probably sounds cold, calculated, maybe even cruel. But before you judge me, let me take you back to where this all began, to a cramped apartment in Portland, Oregon, where I met Daniel Hartwell at a mutual friend's dinner party in the winter of 2019. He was tall, gentle, with kind eyes that seemed perpetually apologetic, as though he was sorry for taking up space in the world. He worked at his father's real estate firm, doing, well, nothing important, from what I could gather. Filing, coffee runs, the occasional showing of properties nobody wanted to buy. I was a business strategist at McKinley & Associates, the kind of consultant companies hired when they needed someone to tell them uncomfortable truths about why they were failing. I was good at seeing patterns, at understanding what made businesses thrive or collapse. I was 28, hungry, and convinced I could fix anything if given enough data and time. Daniel and I shouldn't have worked. On paper, we were mismatched, me with my MBA and my 100-hour work weeks, him with his stalled career and his quiet acceptance of mediocrity. But there was something about him that drew me in. A kindness, a gentleness, a potential that nobody, least of all Daniel himself, seemed to recognize. We dated for 6 months before I met his parents. Daniel kept putting it off, making excuses until finally I insisted. They're important to you, I said. I want to meet them. The look on his face should have warned me. Richard and Patricia Hartwell lived in a sprawling house in Lake Oswego, the kind of place with too many rooms and too much marble, where every surface seemed designed to remind you of how much money they had. Patricia answered the door in pearls and judgment, her eyes scanning me from head to toe in the 3 seconds it took for her smile to become fixed and artificial. So you're Sarah, she said, making my name sound like an accusation. Daniel's told us so much about you. She hadn't told me anything specific, but the tone said it all. Not good enough, not rich enough, not white enough. I'm half Chinese on my mother's side, and while I'd like to say I've never encountered prejudice, that would be a lie. Patricia's prejudice was the subtle kind, the kind that hides behind politeness and proper manners, while slowly poisoning everything it touches. Dinner was excruciating. Richard, a barrel-chested man who spoke in pronouncements rather than conversations, dominated the table with stories of his business successes. Daniel barely spoke, shrinking into himself with each passing course. When I mentioned my work at McKinley, Patricia's smile grew tighter. How modern, she said. Women in business. Though I always thought the most important job a woman could have was supporting her husband and raising children properly. Daniel stared at his plate. I smiled and changed the subject. The worst part came after dinner when Richard cornered Daniel in his study. I could hear their voices through the door, Richard's booming and authoritative, Daniel's quiet and defeated. When Daniel emerged 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd been hollowed out. In the car on the way home, he was silent, until I finally asked what his father had said. "The usual," Daniel muttered, "that I'm wasting my potential at the firm, that I need to work harder, be better, stop embarrassing the family name, that dating you is—" He stopped. "Is what?" "A distraction. That I should be focused on building my career, not on a relationship that's going nowhere." I felt the words like a slap. "And what did you say?" Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I said he was wrong. That you're the best thing that's happened to me. That I love you." He'd never said it before. 3 little words, delivered in a car on a dark Portland street, in defiance of his father's disapproval. I reached over and squeezed his hand, and in that moment, I made a decision. I was going to prove to Daniel and to his toxic, controlling parents exactly what he was capable of. We got engaged 6 months later. The wedding was small, over Patricia's very vocal objections that we should have something proper with 300 guests and an orchestra. We had 40 people in a garden venue, and it was perfect. Daniel's parents attended with the enthusiasm of people at a funeral, sitting in the front row with matching expressions of disappointment. The first year of marriage was hard in ways I hadn't anticipated. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland, combining our incomes to make ends meet while I worked on my plan. Because yes, I had a plan. I'd been watching Daniel, studying him the way I studied struggling businesses, and I could see the problem clearly. He had potential, talent, and intelligence, but they'd been systematically suppressed by parents who needed him to fail so they could feel superior. Richard's real estate firm was old-fashioned, stuffy, focused on traditional residential sales in a market that was rapidly evolving. Daniel had ideas. I'd heard him talk about them late at night. Excited thoughts about commercial development, about mixed-use properties, about the tech boom that was transforming Portland. But every time he brought an idea to his father, Richard shot it down. Too risky, too modern. Not how they'd always done things. "What if you started your own company?" I asked one night over takeout Chinese food. Daniel looked at me like I'd suggested he fly to Mars. "My own company? Sarah, I don't have the capital, or the connections, or—" "You have me," I interrupted. "I have connections from McKinley. I understand business strategy, and we have some savings. Not much, but enough to start small. My parents would be furious. Your parents are already furious. They're furious that you married me. They're furious that you're not living up to whatever impossible standard they've set. So, what do you have to lose?" I watched the fear and hope war on his face. Hope won. We started Hartwell Properties in April 2020, the worst possible time to start a business, right as the pandemic was shutting down the world. But crisis creates opportunity, and I'd learned at McKinley that the companies that thrived were the ones that adapted fastest. While traditional real estate firms were panicking, we pivoted to virtual tours, remote closings, and a focus on properties that served the new work-from-home reality. I worked my regular job during the day and Daniel's business at night. I built the website. I created the marketing strategy. I identified properties that were undervalued because their owners were desperate to sell. I leveraged every contact I had, calling in favors, making introductions, positioning Daniel as the forward-thinking real estate developer Portland needed. And Daniel, he was brilliant. Once freed from his father's constant criticism, his confidence bloomed. He had vision, charisma, an ability to read what clients needed before they knew it themselves. The business grew faster than either of us anticipated. By the end of 2020, we'd closed $2 million in sales. By mid-2021, we'd doubled that. But success, as I was learning, brought its own problems. Specifically, it brought Richard and Patricia back into our lives with a vengeance. The first time they called asking for money, I was stunned. These were people who lived in a mansion, who'd spent decades looking down on us, and now Richard was on the phone explaining that the firm was going through a rough patch, and could Daniel spare $50,000? Just temporarily, of course. Family helps family. Daniel wanted to say yes immediately. I convinced him to wait, to think about it. We compromised. He loaned them $25,000 with a clear repayment schedule. They never paid back a cent. The requests kept coming. Car repairs, home renovations, a business opportunity that Richard needed seed money for. Each time, Patricia would call first, softening Daniel up with guilt, reminding him of everything they'd sacrificed for him: private schools, college tuition, their disappointment when he left the family firm. Then Richard would call with the actual request, making it sound like Daniel's duty as a son to support them. I watched my husband shrink a little more with each call. The worst part wasn't the money, though watching our hard-earned success drain into their bottomless pit of entitlement was painful enough. The worst part was the constant undermining. Patricia would call me directly, her voice dripping with false sweetness, to express concern about how much Daniel was working. "He looks so tired," she'd say. "I hope you're not pushing him too hard. Men need support at home, not a wife who's constantly pushing them." If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more like it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps me continue sharing these important stories. At family dinners, which we were expected to attend monthly, Richard would hold court, talking about real estate and the proper way to do business, making subtle digs at Daniel's trendy approach. When Daniel tried to share a success, Richard would find a way to minimize it. Well, of course, mixed-use developments are popular now, but they're not sustainable long-term. Traditional residential is the foundation of the industry. Patricia had her own special brand of poison. She'd corner me in the Kit Harper, offering to help with cooking, while making comments about my appearance, my career, my devotion to Daniel. You know, dear, successful men need wives who can focus on them, not on their own ambitions. I gave up my career when I married Richard. That's what real partnership looks like. I'd bite my tongue and smile, counting the minutes until we could leave. The turning point came in March 2022, 2 years into building the business. We'd just secured the Whitman contract, a massive commercial development deal that would establish Hartwell Properties as a major player in the Portland market. It was the culmination of 18 months of work, of late nights and strategic planning, and Daniel's brilliant negotiation. We were celebrating at dinner, just the two of us, when his phone rang. Patricia. She called 3 times before Daniel finally answered. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but I could fill in the blanks easily enough. His face went from happy to confused to devastated in the span of 2 minutes. "Mom, I don't understand. We're having dinner. No, I haven't forgotten about you. That's not fair. I can't just—" He listened for a long time, his food getting cold, his celebration ruined. When he finally hung up, he looked like he might cry. "What did she want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would infuriate me. "She's upset that we haven't invited them to dinner recently. She says I'm abandoning them now that I have money, that I'm letting you poison me against my own family." He looked at me with such anguish. "She said you're only with me for the money, that you've been planning this from the beginning, that you're manipulating me." I felt the rage rise in my throat, hot and bitter, but I kept my voice calm. "Daniel, do you believe that?" "No, of course not." "But—" He trailed off, looking miserable. "But what?" "They're my parents. I can't just cut them off. They're family." "Family," I repeated. "Daniel, tell me something. When was the last time they called to ask how you were doing? Not to ask for money, not to criticize your choices, but to genuinely check on your well-being?" He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He couldn't think of a single instance. When was the last time your mother complimented you? When was the last time your father said he was proud of you? Silence. That's not family, Daniel. That's a hostage situation. But he wasn't ready to hear it yet. Not fully. So we kept going, kept building the business, kept fielding the endless demands and criticisms. Daniel gave them more money, another $30,000 for Patricia's medical expenses, that seemed to include a spa retreat in Napa. He attended their dinners, endured their comments, came home exhausted and diminished. And I watched the man I loved slowly erode under the weight of their toxic expectations. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. We'd been invited to Thanksgiving dinner at his parents' house, an invitation that felt more like a summons. I'd spent 3 days preparing a dish to bring, my grandmother's recipe for braised short ribs, a family treasure I rarely made because it was so labor-intensive. It was my way of trying to bridge the gap, to show Patricia that I respected the importance of family traditions. We arrived at noon with the carefully wrapped dish. Patricia took one look at it and said, "Oh, you brought something. How ethnic. I'm sure we'll find room for it somewhere." She set it on the Kit Harper counter and never served it. The dinner was worse than usual. Richard was in rare form, pontificating about politics and business, while Daniel and I tried to eat in peace. When dessert came, Patricia pulled out photo albums, pictures of Daniel as a child, Daniel as a teenager, all his milestones documented in glossy photographs. "Remember when Daniel was going to be a lawyer?" Patricia said, showing me a picture of teenage Daniel in a mock trial competition. "He was so brilliant. We had such high hopes for him." "He's still brilliant," I said carefully. "He's built an incredibly successful company." Richard snorted. "With your help, presumably. Daniel's never been much of a self-starter." Daniel's face went red. "Dad, that's not—" "It's fine, son. We all know your wife is the real brains behind the operation. Nothing to be ashamed of. Some men are better at taking direction." The contempt in his voice was palpable. I felt Daniel flinch beside me, saw him shrinking again into that apologetic, diminished version of himself, and something in me snapped. "Actually, Richard, Daniel is one of the most innovative developers in Portland right now. He's transformed the company from a startup to an 8-figure operation in less than 3 years. Yes, I helped with strategy. That's what partners do. But his vision, his client relationships, his ability to see opportunities others miss, that's all him. Maybe if you'd recognized that instead of constantly tearing him down, he wouldn't have needed to start his own company to prove his worth." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face went white, then red. "How dare you speak to my husband that way in our home? How dare you speak to your son the way you do in any home?" I shot back. "Daniel is successful, happy, building something meaningful, but you can't stand it because it means you were wrong about him. You've spent his entire life convincing him he's not good enough, that he needs to earn your approval, that he's somehow deficient. And the truth is, the only thing deficient here is your ability to see the incredible man he's become." Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. "Get out! Get out of my house!" Gladly, I stood, grabbing my purse. Daniel sat frozen, looking between his parents and me with panic in his eyes. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice cold, "you can leave with her if you want. But if you do, don't expect anything from us again. No more family, no more support. You'll be choosing her over your own blood." I watched Daniel's face. This was the moment. This was where he decided who he was going to be. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking. "Dad, you've never supported me, not really. You've given me money, yes, but you've never believed in me, never trusted my judgment. Never treated me like I was capable of anything worthwhile." His voice grew stronger with each word. Sarah believed in me when no one else did. She helped me build something I'm proud of. She's been more family to me in 3 years than you've been in 30. So yes, I'm choosing her. I'm choosing us." We left. Patricia was crying. Richard was shouting. But we walked out into the cold November night and got in the car and drove away. Daniel was silent for the first 10 minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. Then he pulled over into a parking lot and broke down sobbing. I held him while he cried, years of suppressed pain and frustration pouring out. "Did I just lose my family?" he whispered. "No," I said firmly. "You just freed yourself from people who were holding you hostage. There's a difference." That night, in our apartment, we had the hardest conversation of our marriage. Daniel wanted to call them, to apologize, to smooth things over. I told him he could, that it was his choice. Always his choice. But I also told him what I'd been holding back for 3 years, that watching them diminish him was killing me, that I couldn't stand by and watch the man I loved be systematically destroyed by people who were supposed to love him. "They're parasites," I said. "They've been feeding off you emotionally and financially for years. They take and take and take, and they give nothing back but criticism and control. And I know you love them because they're your parents. But love isn't supposed to hurt this much, Daniel. It's not supposed to feel like drowning." He listened. Really listened. And then he said something that surprised me. "I think I've always known. I just didn't want to admit it." We spent that night talking about what it would mean to cut contact. The guilt he'd feel, the family events he'd miss, the criticism from extended relatives who wouldn't understand, the freedom it might bring, the peace we could find without their constant interference. By morning, Daniel had made his decision. He sent an email, not a call, because he knew he'd lose his nerve if he heard his mother's voice. The email was clear, firm, and final. He explained that their relationship had become toxic, that he needed distance to focus on his own life and marriage, that he would no longer be providing financial support or attending family gatherings. He wished them well, but made it clear the decision was final. "I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? Have you experienced similar manipulation or control? Share your story below." Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is realize we're not alone in these struggles. The response was immediate and vicious. Patricia called 17 times in the first hour. When Daniel didn't answer, she started texting, long, rambling messages about his ingratitude, his selfishness, how he was destroying the family. Richard sent one message: "You're dead to me." Daniel's phone buzzed constantly for 3 days. We finally blocked their numbers. The next few weeks were difficult. Daniel would wake up in the middle of the night, anxious, questioning whether he'd made the right choice. We'd talk it through, and by morning, he'd remember all the reasons why cutting contact was necessary. It was a process, letting go of people who'd been central to his life for so long, even if that centrality had been toxic. But slowly, gradually, something beautiful happened. Without his parents' constant negativity, Daniel started to flourish in ways I'd never seen. He became more confident, more decisive. He took bigger risks in business, trusting his instincts instead of second-guessing every decision. He laughed more. He slept better. He was present in our marriage in a way he'd never been able to be, when part of him was always braced for the next criticism from his parents. The business continued to grow. We hired a small team, expanded into commercial development, took on projects that excited us rather than ones we thought would earn approval. By late 2023, Hartwell Properties had established itself as one of the premier boutique development firms in the Pacific Northwest. We were profitable, respected, and most importantly, building something that reflected our values rather than anyone else's expectations. The poetic justice came in unexpected ways. We heard through the grapevine that Richard's firm was struggling. Turns out the traditional approach wasn't serving them well in a rapidly changing market. They'd had to lay off staff, downsize their office. Patricia had to take a part-time job at a boutique to help make ends meet. The mansion in Lake Oswego went on the market. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall. That's what surprised me most. I'd spent so much time angry at them, so much energy resenting their treatment of Daniel, that I expected to feel vindicated when karma came around. Instead, I just felt empty. They were people I used to know, people who'd made choices that led to consequences. Their struggles weren't my concern anymore. Daniel felt similarly. When he heard about his father's business troubles, he was quiet for a long time. "Part of me wants to help," he finally said, "even after everything." "I know," I told him. "That's because you're a good person. But helping them wouldn't actually help them, would it? It would just enable the same patterns. They need to figure out their own path forward." He nodded, understanding, but still sad. Cutting toxic people from your life doesn't mean you stop caring about them. It just means you stop letting them hurt you. We built our life deliberately, carefully, surrounding ourselves with people who supported and celebrated us. We hosted dinners with friends who made Daniel laugh. We traveled, places his parents had always said were too risky or not worth it. We made decisions based on what we wanted, not what anyone expected of us. The most significant change was in our marriage. Without the constant interference, without Daniel's emotional energy being drained by his parents' demands, we found a depth of connection we'd never quite achieved before. We were partners in the truest sense, equals who respected each other, supported each other, challenged each other to grow. In 2024, we bought our first house. Not a mansion like his parents' place, but a beautiful craftsman home in Northeast Portland with a garden and a view of Mount Hood on clear days. We furnished it slowly, choosing pieces that meant something to us rather than trying to impress anyone. It felt like home in a way our apartment never quite had, a space that was entirely ours, free from the shadows of family expectation. Daniel's extended family eventually came around. His aunt reached out first, apologizing for not understanding what was happening, explaining that Patricia had been telling everyone Daniel had abandoned them without cause. When Daniel explained the real situation, the constant criticism, the financial manipulation, the emotional abuse, she listened with growing horror. "I had no idea it was that bad," she said. "Your mother always made it sound like you were just being difficult." Other relatives followed. Cousins Daniel hadn't spoken to in years reached out, some to apologize, some to share their own stories of Patricia and Richard's toxic behavior. Apparently, we weren't the only ones who'd been damaged by their need for control. There's something validating about learning you weren't crazy, that others saw what you saw, that the problem was never you. The business continued to thrive. We hired carefully, building a team that shared our values: innovation, integrity, respect. We treated our employees well, paid them fairly, created a workplace culture that was the opposite of everything Daniel had experienced in his father's firm. Several of our team members commented on how different we were from other developers, how they'd never worked somewhere that felt so collaborative and positive. "That's what happens when you build something without toxic influence," Daniel told me one night after a particularly successful team meeting. "You create the environment you wish you'd had." By our 5th anniversary, Hartwell Properties was worth $12 million. We developed 3 major mixed-use projects, revitalized a struggling commercial district, and earned a reputation for ethical, sustainable development. Industry publications featured us. Other developers sought our advice. Daniel was invited to speak at conferences, to share his approach and philosophy. The man who'd once shrunk in his father's presence now commanded rooms. He spoke with confidence and clarity about his vision for urban development. about creating spaces that served communities rather than just profit margins. Watching him present at a conference, fielding questions from developers twice his age, I felt overwhelming pride. This was the Daniel I'd always seen underneath the suppression and self-doubt. This was who he'd been waiting to become. I want to pause and thank you for listening to this story. If it's resonated with you, if you found value in hearing about our journey, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps me continue sharing these stories, and your comments remind me why they matter. Thank you. We never heard from Richard or Patricia again, though we tracked their lives indirectly through mutual acquaintances. They divorced in 2025, apparently without Daniel to blame for their problems. They'd turned on each other. Richard moved to a small condo in Beaverton. Patricia relocated to Arizona to be near her sister. The mansion sold for less than they'd hoped. The firm eventually closed. I wish I could say their downfall brought me satisfaction, but it didn't. They were just people who'd made terrible choices, who'd prioritized control over love, who'd driven away the one person who'd have supported them if they'd only treated him with basic respect. Their tragedy was of their own making, and there was nothing triumphant about it, just a sad waste of what could have been. Daniel and I occasionally talked about what it would take for us to reconnect with his parents. The answer was always the same: genuine change, real accountability, an acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused. We left the door open for that possibility, but we both knew it would probably never come. People like Richard and Patricia rarely change because they rarely believe they've done anything wrong. The real transformation was internal. Daniel stopped waiting for his father's approval. He stopped measuring his worth against impossible standards. He built a life based on his own values, his own definition of success. And that life? It was better than anything his parents could have offered him. I remember one evening in our garden, about 6 years after we'd cut contact. We were having wine, watching the sunset paint Mount Hood pink and gold, talking about our next project. Daniel turned to me suddenly and said, "Thank you." For what? For seeing me when no one else did. For believing I could be more than they said I was. For having the strength to help me walk away when I didn't have it myself. I squeezed his hand. "You had the strength all along. You just needed permission to use it." "No," he said firmly. "I needed you. I needed someone who loved me enough to tell me the truth, even when the truth was hard. You saved me, Sarah." "We saved each other," I corrected. "That's what partners do." And that's the truth of it. I didn't help Daniel get rich just to cut off his toxic parents, though that was certainly a satisfying side effect. I helped him build his success because I loved him, because I saw his potential, because I knew he deserved better than the diminished life his parents had mapped out for him. The wealth we built wasn't about money, though financial security certainly helped. It was about freedom. Freedom to choose our own path, to surround ourselves with people who genuinely cared about us, to build a life that reflected our values rather than anyone else's expectations. It was about proving that success doesn't require tolerating abuse, that family isn't defined by blood, but by respect and genuine love. Cutting off Richard and Patricia wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-preservation, of choosing health over toxicity, of recognizing that some relationships cost more than their worth. And while it was painful for both of us, in different ways, it was also necessary. Necessary for Daniel to become who he was meant to be. Necessary for our marriage to thrive. Necessary for us to build the life we truly wanted. 7 years after we started Hartwell Properties, I can look around at what we've built and feel genuine pride, not just in the business, though. That's significant. But in the marriage we've created, the partnership we've sustained, the mutual respect and love that underpins everything we do. We face the hardest choice a person can face, family or self. And we chose self. We chose us. Daniel still has moments of sadness, especially around holidays or his birthday. There's always a part of him that grieves the parents he wished he'd had, the family relationships that could have been, but never were. I understand that grief because I share it in my own way. I'd wanted to be part of a big, loving family. I'd wanted Daniel's parents to see me, to value me, to recognize the partnership their son and I had built. But we don't get to choose whether people change. We only get to choose how we respond to who they are. And Richard and Patricia showed us exactly who they were, repeatedly, until we finally listened. The lesson I've learned from all of this is that sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is help them walk away from people who are destroying them, even if those people are family. Sometimes the most important boundary you'll ever establish is the one that says, I deserve respect, and I won't accept less. I helped Daniel get rich not for revenge. Though there's a certain poetic justice in the outcome, I helped him succeed because that's what you do when you love someone. You help them become the best version of themselves. The fact that his success made it possible for us to cut off his toxic parents, that was just the practical application of our newfound freedom. Today, Hartwell Properties continues to grow. We've expanded into sustainable development, affordable housing projects, community-focused design. We're building things that matter, that make Portland a better place to live. And we're doing it without the weight of toxic family expectations crushing Daniel's spirit. We have friends who love us, a team that respects us, a marriage that grows stronger every year. We have quiet mornings in our garden, spontaneous trips to the coast, dinner parties where everyone laughs and no one tears anyone down. We have peace. That's what cutting off his parents bought us. Not spite, not revenge, not vindication. Just peace. The space to breathe, to grow, to love each other without constant interference. The freedom to build our own definition of family, one based on choice and respect, rather than obligation and toxicity. I won't pretend it was easy. Cutting off family never is, even when it's necessary. There were guilt-ridden nights, second-guessing, moments of doubt. There were holidays that felt empty, birthdays that ached with absence. There were extended family members who didn't understand, who thought we were being too harsh, too unforgiving. But every time we wavered, we'd remember. We'd remember the constant criticism, the financial manipulation, the way Patricia's voice could make Daniel shrink into himself. We'd remember Richard's contempt, the death of Daniel's dreams under the weight of his father's disapproval. We'd remember how it felt to live under that shadow, and we'd know we'd made the right choice. The truth is, I didn't do this for Daniel alone. I did it for both of us, for the life we deserve to build together. I did it because watching the man I loved be systematically destroyed by people who claimed to love him was killing me too. I did it because partnership means protecting each other, even when that protection requires difficult choices. If you're facing a similar situation, if you're dealing with toxic family members, if you're watching someone you love be diminished by people who should support them, if you're wondering whether cutting contact is too extreme, please know this. You deserve peace. You deserve relationships that build you up instead of tearing you down. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to love you properly. It's been 7 years since that Thanksgiving dinner. 7 years since Daniel chose us over them. 7 years of growth, success, and building a life we're proud of. And if I could go back and do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing. Well, maybe one thing. I'd have encouraged Daniel to cut them off sooner. Thank you for listening to my story, for taking the time to understand our journey, for being part of this community. If this resonated with you, please subscribe if you haven't already. Share your experiences in the comments. Your words matter, your stories matter. And together, we create a space where people can feel seen and understood. Until next time, remember, family is who we choose it to be. Choose wisely. Choose people who celebrate you, who support you, who respect you, and never apologize for walking away from people who refuse to do those things, no matter how they're related to you. You deserve better. We all do. And sometimes, getting better means having the courage to cut off the sources of toxicity in our lives, even when they share our DNA. Be well, be strong, and never underestimate your worth. Thank you for being here.